a call from America. He Catholic Church is by nature a missionary organizer. Tion. Her program of evangelization is not peculiar to any one age, but dates back to the days of her divine founder. His command, going therefore, teach ye all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, has been at once the inspiration and the motive force behind her glorious missionary record. No region on the face of the earth, no racial barrier, has been so impenetrable but that it would admit the Catholic missioner. Wherever the light of the gospel has been needed to illumine spiritually darkened minds, there have been found heroic souls willingly sacrificing everything this world holds dear to undertake the task. The implanting of Christianity in America was no exception to the rule. The opening of the Western Hemisphere to European exploration and colonization marked also the beginning of the greatest missionary era of all time. Spain and France especially vied with each other in sending to the new, world-zealous missionaries who carved out of its vastness their own respective spheres of influence. The Old Northwest was the locale for the particularly flourishing missionary activity carried on under the French regime between 1670 and 1740. This huge territory lies within an inverted triangle whose base extends from the Straits of Sault Ste. Marie to the southern shore of the Lake of the Woods, and whose apex is marked by the conflux of the Illinois River with the Mississippi. The region is of interest to us, for it was in this selfsame territory that Baraga and Pierce took up the work of the French. Black robes. There was a long list of the latter, and it includes some of the most outstanding names in the annals of the Church's mission history. The opening wedge was made by Father Charles Rainbow and Father Isaac Jogues, who accepted the invitation of some Ottawa chiefs to visit them at their tribal headquarters about 100 leagues west of Huronia, while they did nothing more than to establish a foothold at what came to be known as Sault Ste. Marie. Their expedition was important, for it opened the way for their successors, and these came one after the other: Gabriel Druillettes, Leonard Garreau, René Menard, Claude Alois, Jacques Marquette, Sebastian Rel, Jean Aulneau, all of them Jesuits. The cruel massacre of Father Aulneau and his party of 21 voyageurs upon Minnesota soil, somewhere on the southern shore of the Lake of the Woods, brought to a close a century-long program of intense missionary endeavor. Under the auspices of the French Jesuits, Father Aulneau had no successor. The field was untouched for almost a century. Then came Frederick Baraga and his Slovenian compatriots, among them Francis Xavier Pierce. Dr. Newt, Minnesota historian, writes of this period, Baraga revived the Church's interest in the Indians of the upper Great Lakes. For nearly a century it had lain dormant, while French and English soldiers fought for control of Canada and Europe. It was useless to think of missionary activity while the French and Indian Wars, the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the War of 1812 were being fought. The close of this last war brought with it a great migration to the West. Once more, men saw the needs of the Indian. The resulting outburst of missionary activity is well known. Except for the Bishop of Quebec, however, no Catholic prelate interested himself in the Indians about Sault Ste. Marie, Lake Superior, and the Red River of the North, and even this churchman's prime interest was the half-breeds, voyageurs, and colonists of the Red River settlements. So it remained for Baraga in the 30s to open the new field. Baraga's name was soon on the lips of Catholics throughout the Christian world. His personality was so rich and winning, his letters to Europe were so moving in behalf of his red children, and his sermons and appeals from the pulpit, while on return trips to European cities, were so eloquent that money and missionaries flowed to the new area. 2. No one more eagerly awaited each mission letter as it came from America than a simple and unknown priest in charge of a small but thriving country parish in Upper Carniola. This was Francis Xavier Pierce, soon to win a reputation for apostolic achievement equal to that of the great Slovene pioneer himself. Baraga's letters, bursting as they were with zeal and enthusiasm, enkindled in him the desire to become a missionary in America and devote the remainder of his life to the welfare of the Indians. He thrilled to the stirring accounts of work among them. He longed to experience for himself that deep spiritual satisfaction, which is the inevitable reward of such selfless labor. Above all, he was haunted by Baraga's fervent appeals for volunteers to aid in the gigantic task. One such appeal is quoted here. Truly, the want of priests in our diocese is a pitiable one. Would that some zealous priests of my fatherland resolve to come to this wilderness, to rescue from ruin these scattered pagans whom one priest alone cannot visit. Would it not sufficiently repay to work and to suffer much in order to save even one soul? But here souls are saved not by ones but by hundreds. Any priest who would come here could, with the help of God, save hundreds of souls if he had but little of missionary zeal. Only one thing kept Father Pierce from begging leave of his bishop at once to go to America: his age. He was almost 50 years old when he first heard the call of the missions. He had a comfortable benefice in Podbrezje and was well liked by his parishioners. He had been a priest for 20 years and was settled in his ways. Still, the idea of ending his days as a missionary grew on him. He wondered only whether he could endure the rigors and deprivations of such a strenuous life at his advanced age. This single doubt prevented him from reaching a decision sooner. When finally he did appeal to Father Baraga to accept him as a co-worker, the latter extended a warm welcome to his countrymen. This reply was made through Bishop Reza of Detroit in a letter written on June 13, 1834. From Sault Ste. Marie. The bishop had added his personal note, "I shall gladly receive Reverend Father Pierce into my diocese." This was incentive enough for him. Without further delay, Father Pierce applied to his own ordinary, Bishop Wolf of Ljubljana, for release from his jurisdiction. No doubt the bishop was as much taken aback by his request as were Pierce's friends when the surprising news of his decision reached them. Like them, he must at first have placed little credence in the seriousness of the man's intentions. However, when he saw that Pierce was not to be put off, he reluctantly granted him a release. The bishop's testimonial, issued under date of April 14, 1835, reveals to us the sterling qualities which made Father Pierce such a successful priest in his native land. Bishop Wolf speaks of him in terms so glowing that it is not difficult to see why that ordinary released his priest to the Bishop of Detroit with a sorrowing, even though a benevolent heart. He singled out especially the scrupulous devotion to duty which had characterized Father Pierce's entire priestly ministry since the day of his ordination, and particularly his generosity toward the poor. With such a record to speak for Father Pierce, Bishop Wolf had no hesitation whatsoever in recommending him to the American prelate. The wording of the document indicates that Father Pierce was released in perpetuity to the Diocese of Detroit. However, the door was left open for the departing priest's return should he decide after a trial period on the missions that that life was not for him. Instead of calling together the eligible priests for a concursus to fill the vacancy occasioned by Pierce's departure, Bishop Wolf decided to bide his time instead. He appointed an ad interim administrator to look after the affairs of the parish, thus making the matter of reinstatement a very simple procedure if Pierce should decide to return. With the new missionary to be, however, the matter was closed. His mind was firmly made up, and once he received his ordinary's permission to go to America, he had no intention of turning back. The news of his imminent departure for the mission spread like wildfire throughout Carniola. His friends, both in the ministry and outside, could hardly believe it. They admired his courage and determination, but shook their heads in dismay. His age was against him, and many of them predicted that Pierce would soon be back among them. Even when he took final leave of his parishioners on June 16, 1835, he had not succeeded in shaking their disbelief. As they crowded around him to bid him farewell, not a few added the remark, "Hope to see you again soon." Father Pierce's first stop on the road to America was at the headquarters of the Leopoldine Association in Vienna. The latter agreed to pay his passage across the Atlantic and also to provide him with supplies for his new work. Once he had completed his business there, he did not delay in the Austrian capital. Its gay life, its romantic atmosphere, its lilting music, its brilliant court functions, none of these held any attraction for him. One thing only concerned him, and that was to get to America as soon as he could. He chose the same route which Baraga had taken before him. After shipping his baggage to New York by way of Trieste, he set out for Le Havre, where his ship was to sail on July 25. The overland trip to the French port was one he always remembered. It was a slow and drawn-out affair in a coach which was anything but comfortable. Indeed, Pierce remarked later that he was unable to take any rest from the day that he left his home until he reached Detroit. During my journey from Laibach to my destination, I was obliged to suffer great inconveniences. Not one night was I able to get a real rest in a good bed. By land, I traveled practically day and night by wagon, an exhausting experience. There were times during that trip when it seemed as if he would never be given the opportunity of working among the Indians. Once this was still in Austria, the coachman purposely took a wrong turn in the effort to sidetrack his passengers in a dark forest. Another time, in France, he had drunken. Driver overturned the coach, and only a benevolent providence saved them all from death when they careened wildly down a steep embankment. However, Father Pierce was destined to spend many more fruitful years in the vineyard of the Lord. He arrived at Le Havre safe and unharmed. Physically, he was exhausted, but his spirits were as strong as ever. Even his narrow escapes did not dampen his enthusiasm. Rather, they served to buoy him up, for they convinced him of one thing: heaven was on his side and was preserving him for an apostolate that all his friends had said could end only in failure. The ocean voyage was no great improvement over the land travel. 19th century sea travel was a far cry from the speedy and comfortable transportation system we know today. Instead of a 5 or 6 day crossing, it usually took from 50 to 60 days, depending upon the wind and weather. The sailing dates posted by agents were only an approximation. Passengers were warned to be on hand on a certain day in order that advantage might be taken of the first fair wind after that date. Of prime interest to Pierce's fellow passengers was the ship itself. Few of them had ever seen anything more impressive than a river barge or a small fishing boat. Their first sight of the emigrant ship, usually a craft of about 300 or 400 tons in size, brought forth cries of admiration. But this enthusiasm soon cooled when they had a look at the passenger lists of several hundred people, all to be crowded into a ship whose holds were already jammed with freight casks of water, and cordwood to be used for fuel. Just above the hold was the steerage. This word has become infamous in the story of 19th century immigration. It was scarcely 6 feet from floor to ceiling, and with no means of entrance but a ladder leading down from a hole in the deck of the hatchway. Around the sides of the steerage ran 2 layers of berths, cumbersome shelves wide enough for 5 persons and filling most of the floor space. Thousands of poor immigrants who traveled to America during the 19th and early 20th centuries spent the time of passage in this ghastly hole. Inhumane crowding, poor ventilation, improper lighting, inadequate toilet facilities, all these contributed to make the Atlantic crossing an unforgettable experience in human misery. What a bedlam must have existed in these holds with people of divers races and nationalities thrown together in such intimate confusion. One student of this phase of our country's history has given us an interesting and even humorous, at least to us, picture of the problem of cooking on these emigrant ships. It is an axiom of domestic science that no kitchen is large enough to hold 2 women, but around this fire a score or more of determined housewives pursued their different culinary purposes. One would be boiling coffee, another preparing a stew, a third with a bowl of batter in, hand-baking pancakes, when a sudden lurch of the vessel would mix coffee, stew, and batter into an unpremeditated combination. Since those awaiting their turn were impatient, the parent was obliged to take the mess to the waiting family as it was, nature perhaps adding a finishing touch by flavoring it with a dash of salt spray. Very often this joggling of elbows caused a serious physical encounter. No matter how dull life might be elsewhere on board, there was always fighting around the stove. And philosophically minded Germans, quietly awaiting their turn, compared the government to the anarchy of the medieval empire when Faust Recht alone prevailed. Under such conditions, breakfast was not ready until noon and dinner until night, and before the end of the journey, both breakfast and dinner might be several days late. Father Pierce became part of this nightmare when he boarded his ship at Le Havre, but he did not spend any time bemoaning his plight or berating himself for having made the foolhardy decision to go to America. He was a son of the people, and he was a priest. Poverty and misery and suffering were not strangers to him. No doubt he spent the long weeks going through the steerage, bringing comfort and cheer to whomever he could. His priestly heart sought to lessen suffering wherever he found it, and many must have been the times when he raised his hand in blessing or in absolution over some miserable child of the church. Disease and death were frequent visitors on the emigrant ships. Our records show that few were free from epidemics of ship fever, smallpox, cholera, and dysentery. These usually reached their high point after a heavy storm, when filth lay scattered thickly on all sides. Despite the fact that Congress had passed various regulatory acts concerning sanitation as early as 1819, no change for the better came until well after the middle of the century. Inevitably, death followed in the wake of disease. The mortality rate was high on every one of these ships. "I never saw people so indifferent to life," wrote a doctor in describing scenes he himself had witnessed on board. They would continue in the same berth with the dead person until the seaman or captain dragged out the corpse with boat hooks. No wonder, then, that all the passengers breathed a sigh of relief when finally they had their first glimpse of New York. What little hope remained in their hearts must be kept alive to face the uncertainties and difficulties that lay ahead. Father. Pierce's vessel docked on September 24, 42 days after leaving Le Havre. He reveals in a letter to a friend in Carniola dated September 29, 1835, the emotions which filled him as he stepped ashore. "Frequently during my journey the temptation of an oppressive fear assailed me, divine providence, however, which led me on to this path, quickly sweetened all the bitterness of my heart. When, after 42 days at sea, I landed in New York, my heart beat joyfully at the first glance of the New World, and soon I was amazed to be received with such spontaneous courtesy by the well-mannered Americans. And what a solace, too, what rich compensation, for me to have the good fortune to increase the flock of Christ by the souls of 2 whom I baptized." We have no way of knowing what he thought of the growing American metropolis, except for the passing reference in the letter just cited to the cordial and polite conduct of the people. Father Pierce makes no further allusion to it, possibly because he was anxious to reach Detroit before the winter set. He did not delay in New York any longer than his business required. He was not a sightseer, and so was not interested in the tourist attractions of the New World. He leaves to another type of traveler the duty of recording European impressions of America and its cities and its people. 19th century America was inundated by huge streams of humanity which made their way to its shores as if to a Mecca. Thousands of European peoples found asylum from want and oppression in this new country. These were the immigrants who came to stay and who would make their own contribution to the American way of life. What they had to say about life and customs in the United States was mostly in the way of personal observations jotted down in their letters to relatives and friends back home, letters which have rarely seen the printed page. Interesting though they must be. But there was another group, of a transient character, who came here with the avowed purpose of observing the mode of life in the new republic. Some of these began their tour convinced that they would find nothing but boorishness and savagery. The more honest of them returned to Europe with the feeling that perhaps America did have something to offer the world after all. Few among the travelers were professional literary people. Some were businessmen, land speculators, merchants. Others were government officials or exiles, naturalists and big game hunters, artists and students, priests and working people. Usually their publications were incidental, by products of visits undertaken for other reasons. They went where their business took them. They could not possibly see everything. They sometimes kept to the main traveled roads and tended to spend more time in town than in country, in the Atlantic ports than in the interior. Such circumstances introduced a bias in these writings. There was always the tendency to generalize on a partial and incomplete basis. But that bias was self-compensating, open and visible enough so that allowance could be made for it. And the same circumstances relieved these works of the ideological and linguistic self-consciousness of the social scientist, gave them a directness of perception and of expression exceedingly valuable to those who seek light on the American social past. It is from one of these reports, written by Henri Hertz, a Viennese concert pianist who toured America in 1846, that we cull a picture of New York in the mid-19th century. In New York, before thinking of giving my first concert in the New World, I wished to see the city and learn something of the strange civilization of this hardy and laborious people. The prodigious number of cases of merchandise which I saw in the port and the commercial movement, which reigned everywhere, gave me the impression of an enormous fairground. A feverish activity seems to obsess these inhabitants of North America. I felt myself the only idler in this nest of human ants. Father Piers reached Detroit on September 16, 1835, just 3 months after bidding farewell to his beloved people of Pas-de-Brege. The long trip overland from New York was made by rail and steamship. His last night on the Great Lakes provided another harrowing experience to record with the many others already encountered and survived. He wrote of it to a friend. The last dark night before landing at Detroit, our steamer collided with another with such force that both, badly damaged, were kept afloat only in a miraculous manner, so that all of us were saved from drowning. At the bishop's house, Father Piers received a warm welcome from the priests in residence there, Fathers Vincent Bodin, Martin Kundig, and Francis Bonduel. He learned that Bishop Risset was absent on a missionary journey, but while awaiting his return, did not remain idle. Since the majority of the Detroit congregation were of French origin, he preached to them in that tongue. This was the first sermon he delivered in America. The ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Detroit, to which Piers was now subject, had been erected only 2 years before. Prior to March 8, 1833, when Gregory XVI, by the bull Maximus Inter Gravissimas Curas, placed it under the Archbishop of Baltimore as a suffragan see, the territory embraced by the new diocese was administered by the Bishop of Cincinnati. The district watered by the 4 Great Lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, and Erie, and in which Fathers Jogues and Rainbow first planted the cross of Catholicity in 1642. In which Fathers Menard and Delhala died by the hands of the Red Men, where Alois and Marquette, Lefranc, and Dujonnet labored, was thus erected into a diocese. The churches at Detroit, Northeast, and Raisin River, Mackinac, Sault Ste., Marie, and Green Bay had their history. The diocese embraced, next to Illinois, the oldest Catholic district in the West. The faithful were still mainly of French origin. Few of other nationalities have settled permanently there. Rome's final choice for first occupant of the See of Detroit fell upon Frederick Risset. The name of Father Gabriel Richard, who had done so much for the advancement of religion and morality in Michigan, had been proposed first. Unfortunately, a scandal in which his priestly zeal had involved him barred the way to episcopal promotion. He had openly denounced the bigamous conduct of a man who had abandoned his lawful wife in Canada and married another in Detroit. The man brought court action, and Father Richard lost the case. His enemies made capital of this and advanced the court condemnation as a reason why he should not be appointed first bishop of Detroit. Ries, who ruled the Diocese of Detroit from 1833 to 1837, came to his post with an outstanding record already behind him. He had served as Vicar General of the Diocese of Cincinnati under Bishop Fenwick, and at the latter's death was appointed administrator of the vacant see. His fruitful labors among the German Catholics of Ohio merited for him the attention of the ecclesiastical authorities. To his zeal is also due in large measure the establishment of the 2 mission aid societies already mentioned, the Leopoldine Association of Austria and the Ludwig Missionsverein of Bavaria. The first bishop of Detroit was a German, born at Wienenberg in Hanover in 1791. Upon reaching manhood, he was drafted into the army and served as a cavalryman in the wars against the French. After completing his military service, he decided to become a missionary priest and was admitted to the College of Propaganda. His first assignment after ordination was to the African missions, but here his health soon failed. Returning to Rome, he met Bishop Fenwick of Cincinnati and listened with interest to what the American bishop had to say about conditions in the United States and the urgent need for priests. When the latter invited him to join his diocese, Ries eagerly accepted. Frederick Ries's administration in Detroit began with great promise for the future of the church in that region. He was no stranger to the territory now under his jurisdiction, for he had traveled its length and breadth as vicar general for Bishop Fenwick. He knew thoroughly the background of the evil which had plagued the church in Michigan, as in so many other parts of the United States, the evil of trusteeism. He had helped to restore order in Detroit, Monroe, and Mackinac, where conditions had been particularly turbulent. He had witnessed also the start of a new effort to convert the Indians and half-breeds living within this region, who included Ottawas, Chippewas, Potawatomis, Menominees, and Winnebagos. But this rosy picture did not last long. Dark clouds soon gathered on the horizon, and in less than 3 years after his consecration, Bishop Riise begged leave of the Holy See to resign his office. Experience proved that he was not the person to fill the responsible position which had been entrusted to him. He was quick, tempered, and impulsive, easily given to discouragement. Frequently he made arbitrary decisions which alienated his clergy and his people. Painfully aware of this situation, the Third Provincial Council of Baltimore recommended that his resignation be accepted. Riise was summoned to Rome, and when he arrived there broken in health and spirit, it was discovered that he was gradually losing his mind. A coadjutor bishop was appointed to administer the affairs of the vacant see of Detroit. Meanwhile, despite every medical attention, Bishop Riise failed rapidly. He died on December 30th, 1871, in a sanitarium in his native Germany. This was the man whom Father Piers met for the first time, on September 28th, 1835, and to whom he pledged obedience as a priest under his jurisdiction. The prelate was most gracious to the newcomer and entertained him with many stories of his experiences in Michigan. He also told him something of what he might expect in this new field of endeavor, of the hardships that he would undoubtedly have to suffer. A few days after his first meeting with the bishop, Father Piers was given his assignment. Father Baraga had written asking for 2 assistants to help him with his work at La Pointe. The mission on Lake Superior, to send 2 priests, was out of the question, for they simply could not be spared. But Bishop Riise asked Piers if he would like to join Baraga at La Pointe. Nothing could have pleased the zealous priest more. Father Baraga's thrilling mission letters had been the inspiration for his decision to come to America, and now he would have the privilege of actually assisting the veteran missionary. Father Piers wrote enthusiastically about his first assignment to a priest friend in Carniola. Just now the bishop received a letter from Father Baraga, sent from his new mission on Lake Superior, 1,000 miles from here, containing the most amazing reports concerning conversions of the savages, and pleadingly requesting that 2 priests be sent to assist him as promptly as possible. The worthy bishop immediately extended the offer to me to fulfill the wish of this apostle among the savages, whose name is already honorably known everywhere in America. I accepted the offer with great pleasure and thank God from the bottom of my heart for considering me worthy of sharing the comfort of soul Father Baraga is enjoying. Father Pierre set out for La Pointe almost immediately. He could not afford to lose any more time awaiting the arrival of his baggage. The long winter was already setting in, and with it traffic on the Great Lakes closed completely. So, carrying only his breviary and Bible and the few dollars the bishop had given him, he boarded a steamer at Detroit to cross Lake Huron to Mackinac, and from there to Sault Ste. Marie. He arrived at the Sault only to learn that Lake Superior was already icebound. Even then, the intrepid missionary did not give up hope of reaching his destination and offered $100 to whoever would take him across. Of course, no one was foolhardy enough to accept this offer, and Pierce was forced to submit to the alternative which Bishop Riise proposed in the event he did not get through. He wrote of this to the directors of the Leopoldine Association in Vienna. On account of the fast advancing winter, no boats were plying on Lake Superior, and I was obliged to return for the winter to La Croix, a submission of Arbre Croche, where I have been, to my great happiness, exercising the sacred ministry for the last 5 months. Even to reach La Croix at that time of the year was a difficult task, and Father Pierce had to wait 11 days at Sault Ste. Marie for a boat which would take him back as far as Boygan. From there the trip was overland for the most part. Meanwhile he relieved Father Haetscher, who was in charge of the mission station located there. The latter took this opportunity to visit an outlying post while Pierce said Mass and preached to the Indians living at the Salt. Father Pierce continued his journey to his winter quarters in weather that was bitter cold. He suffered intense agony since he was wearing summer clothing, his baggage still not having arrived from Trieste. 4 Indians served Father Pierce as guides. They camped 5 nights in the woods, lying on the bare ground, wrapped in a blanket under a cedar exposed to wind and rain. He wrote a vivid account of this trip to his former assistant at Pas de Brège under date of January 15, 1836. On this journey, I passed through entirely uninhabited country and was obliged to spend 5 nights camping in the forest. One night, suffering from the bitter cold, lying on the bare ground, wrapped in a blanket under a cedar, exposed to wind and rain and accompanied by 4 savage companions, I was tempted by the thought, what a change, what a trade from the soft, sheltered bed in the beautiful parish rectory of Berkendorf, which I surrendered to you, to this camp. But the recollection of the duties my present position imposes upon me soon enabled my spirit to conquer the flesh. The very next evening, I reached a beautiful Catholic chapel dedicated to the 7 Daughters of Our Lady. Here I found a settlement of 10 Catholic families, whom I instructed and whose confessions I heard, celebrating Mass and remaining with them for 3 days. Here I exchanged guides, releasing those who had brought me to this point and who would accept no compensation other than my blessing and a few small holy pictures. We crossed 4 large lakes in succession, whose names, however, my companions could not tell me. On and near these lakes I saw great numbers of wild geese and ducks, as plentiful as sparrows are in Europe. Finally, Father Pierce and his companions reached Little Traverse Bay, which he calls the Traverse of the Great Lake Michigan. 2 attempts to launch their frail birch bark canoe, only 15 feet long and 4 wide, ended in failure. Each time the huge waves hurled it back against the rocky shore. Utterly discouraged by these setbacks, the missionary was in favor of awaiting calm weather. However, when he heard his guides speak of wolf packs prowling the surrounding woods in search of food as soon as night fell, he quickly changed his mind. The Indians feared the wolves more than the dangers involved in crossing the stormy lake, and told him that they had no hesitation in taking him across. "We have no fear," they assured him, "because we are guiding a missioner, and we know that God protects such men in a special manner." This time, they succeeded in getting their canoe out into the open water, and after a stormy passage in which all the occupants of the boat were wet through and through, and their clothes frozen stiff, they landed at Arbre Croche, now Harbor Springs. Here Father Pierce was met by the Indian chief from La Croix, who conducted him to his winter home among the Ottawas.